After 46 years in living in one of the toughest, most isolationist communist regimes of all time, the students of Albania decided in 1990, 5 years after the death of dictator Enver Hoxha, that they wanted a new, democratic government put in place that gave them the basic human rights and freedoms that they were denied for their entire lives. The conflict of student protests, uprisings, and the inability of the government to control their citizens was resolved when the government compromised with the people and allowed for the creation of political parties, removed all former communists from power, and allowed free and fair elections that resulted in a democratic parliamentary republic system that still stands today. This event proves that even drastic change is possible without the use of excessive violence, because in just a span of 4 days, the students of Albania managed to persuade their tyrannical dictator and terrorizing government to grant them political pluralism smoothly and peacefully, with limited fallout in comparison to the other communist regimes that toppled in Europe in the late 80s, ultimately illustrating that westernization and transformity in severely oppressive governments in present day, such as North Korea, can be overcome by the perseverance of the people.
The Albanian Communist Party was founded on the 8th of November in 1941 and rose to power over Albania in 1944 after Stalin liberated Albania from Italy at the end of World War II. Enver Hoxha was the head of the Albanian government and controlled the country with an iron fist. Hoxha was an autocratic, Leninist, Marxist dictator who is responsible for turning Albania into one of the strictest and most isolationist regimes that the world has ever seen. Under his rule, he forces people to convert to atheism, took away all of their former private property, and forces people to live in dire conditions of poverty. He took away the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to own private property, and the right to conduct private business. The regime did not allow the people of Albania to leave the country for any reason, and also rarely allowed foreigners into the country. Attempting to leave the country would result in your death. The Albanian public were prohibited from listening to foreign music, and the government dictated what books the people were and were not allowed to read, what the people were allowed to wear, and what jobs the people were forced to do.
Basically, you can literally say that they removed the capacity of the individual to be the individual and think for themselves or do for themselves.
Enver Hoxha installed a group of spies called the Sigurimi, who were in charge of capturing anyone accused of speaking negatively against the regime or disobeying any of the rules the government had placed over the people. The Sigurimi would then execute the accused immediately or send them to work in forced labor camps hundreds of miles away from their homes, where they were underfed, overworked, and most often killed.
They were called working camps, right? Similar to whatever, concentration camps or any other type of hard labor camps. And the worst part of it, that it could go from not only impact the direct family, but even the generations after that.
The people were denied the right of a trial, and it was not significant to the government whether or not the person who they killed was innocent or guilty. However, the punishment did not end there, because the government would punish the extended family of the accused for generations by separating the family on opposite sides of the country.
On my father's side, my uncle, pretty much, he was a prisoner, in the sense that what he did, he performed certain activities that were not viewed as a very pro-government at that time. And what he did just some private work. And then he produced the photographs and he was negotiating with them. So apparently somebody had told on him, and the government did not like his engagement directly with the foreigners, and obviously that was seen as a political crime. He was pretty much, within, over 10 years or more actually, in jail, and his wife had to kind of work as a very, very hard job that only men could otherwise perform. Porters, people that actually can, hard worker, like you put the supplies, but she had to manual labor, but very, very hard labor.
As well as not allowing them to receive a good education. Through this system, Enver Hoxha is responsible for killing over 100,000 of his own people. Through isolating the citizens of Albania so they had no contact with the outside world, the regime brainwashed their people into believing that the horrible lives they lived were far better than any other country outside of Albania. The government was very militaristic and would often parade the military through the capital city of Tirana, in a fashion only parallel to that of Adolf Hitler in the 1940s. The government kept tabs on everyone and tracked everywhere their people went.
Because one thing that the government or the political party in power was good at was keeping tabs of the people that were against them so they can control them.
On April 11, 1985, Enver Hoxha died of complications due to diabetes. His immediate successor, Ramiz Alia, took over as the new supreme leader of Albania. The people started to see the cracks in the system and came to the conclusion that the government was not as mighty as it claimed to be and not powerful enough to stop them anymore. News of what life was like in other countries began to infiltrate the country, and spurred by news of the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, and the toppling of other communist regimes in Europe, people camped out on the lawns of foreign embassies for a month until the government compromised with the people and allowed some of them to travel to foreign countries and leave for the first time in 5 decades.
However, the conflict and compromise did not end here. The spark for the movement to replace the isolationist communist regime in Albania began when the students spoke up about the condition of the universities that they studied in. The condition of the universities located in Student City in Tirana in October of 1990 were horrendous. They had broken windows, no heat, sporadic water, and electricity cuts. By mid-October, some students refused to eat the deplorable food at the cafeteria. The Organization of Students and Young Intellectuals was cautiously created the previous spring to discuss the difficult living conditions and political reform. The goals of change, freedom, and democracy emerged. Our inspiration was not political but personal, explained Blendi Gonja, a student activist from that time. In November of 1990, students wrote letters to Ramiz Alia and the government asking for reform. They requested a meeting with the Prime Minister, Adil Charchani, and complained about economic conditions at the university. "You can't make a new coat with old cloth," the letter said. On December 8, 1990, out of desperation, engineering students at the university built heating coils out of bed springs to warm their rooms. The devices strained the transformer that supplied the dormitories, causing the transformer to blow out, and the lights went out. In the darkness, people began to yell out, "Freedom, we want democracy." Between 50 and 100 chanting students moved towards the open space in the center of Student City. Other dormitories with light also turned off theirs in solidarity. "Every light out was a great joy," said one of the student leaders, Arben Lika. Azem Haidari, a 27-year-old philosophy student from Tropoia in the north, became the leader of the student revolution and eventually the head of Albania's first opposition party. The students continued into Budi Street in Tirana, where they were met by police led by Hekuran Isai, the Minister of the Interior. "Get 15 people to go to the university," Isai said. Ramiz Alia had agreed to talk.
In an interview conducted by Fred Abrams in 2002, Alia said, "They told me they had economic concerns. I asked them, or better said, when I told them, 'Listen, the problem you have, why do you have the Communist Youth Organization? Discuss it with them.' A few of them said, 'We don't trust that organization. We want to create our own independent organization.' After my intervention, they presented the issue. It was clear that it was a political rather than economic problem. The same night, a group of art students protested by gathering at the Academy of Arts to honor the 10-year anniversary of John Lennon's death. They sang and danced to his forbidden songs, such as Imagine and Revolution, and turned portraits of Hoxha and Alia upside down or replaced them with pictures of Lenin. They then went to join the rest of the students who were protesting in Tirana, and shortly after, the 15 students who spoke with Alia returned to address the rest of their classmates when a violent outbreak occurred between police and protesters. Suddenly, the police struck, the crowd split. I ran," said Ardian Closey, one of the art demonstrators.
The next day, on December 9th, thousands of students gathered and marched from Student City into Elbasan Street in Tirana, where riot police were waiting for them. They were chanting, "We is all Europe, all Tirana is with us." Then, all of a sudden, the students closest to the police heard the order on the police radio, "Disperse them with force." The students sprinted into apartment buildings, and the next morning, on December 10th, for the first time, the government acknowledged that the police had clashed with protesters. Sadi Berisha and Bisnik Mustafai, two more conservative students who had close ties to the communist government, traveled to Student City to try to find compromise with the students. The students refused to listen to them, and more students than ever gathered in Student City's open space, later named Democracy Square. The student leaders came up with a list of 9 demands for Ramiz Alia, including an increase in reforms, political pluralism, punishment for the police who had beaten students, legalization of the Organization of Students and Young Intellectuals, and a meeting with Alia. In the afternoon, Alia sent 2 officials to negotiate with the organizing committee. The students agreed to form a delegation to meet Alia under the condition that they must meet Alia as President of the Republic and not as the first Secretary of the Party of Labor. The meeting was set for December 12th at the Presidential Palace, known as the Palace of the Brigades. December 11th marked the 4th day of the Student City Revolt. The students elected 45 delegates, although this later would be reduced to 30, to represent them in the first free election since 1951. This delegation would later become known as the Democratic Party. Later that day, the Central Committee of the government voted 98% yes to allow the creation of independent political organizations. On December 12th, the crowd in Student City had grown to a massive 80,000 people. They followed the delegation to meeting with Aliyah. Aliyah announced that they would be given the right to political pluralism. At the end of the meeting, many of the students surrounded him and shook his hand at the door, thanking him for the chance to meet. The Albanian flag rose up over the humongous crowd of people this time without the communist star. However, the liberal movement against the totalitarian regime was still not over, and on February 20th of 1991, the people gathered again to topple the giant statue of Enver Hoxha that was located in the center of Albania's capital of Tirana. The first contested election in Albania since 1923 occurred in March of 1991. However, a strike in opposition of the people occurred after the first election left the Communist Labour Party in power. In order for the government to come to a full compromise with the democratic protesters, a new stability government was formed that included non-communist politicians. In the March of 1992 election, the Democratic Party won most of the seats in parliament, former communists were routed out of the government, and Sadi Berisha became the president. After decades of one of the most brutal and isolationist communist regimes under the paranoid dictator Enver Hoxha, the Albanian government was able to compromise with the people to create a democratic parliament.
The development of a democratic parliament and the forced removal of all former communists from positions of leadership led to Albania becoming the unitary, parliamentary, constitutional republic that it is today, where the President of Albania is the head of state and the Prime Minister of Albania is the head of government in a multi-party system. In 2009, Albania became a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and in 2014, Albania was granted candidate status for accession into the European Union, a symbol that illustrates how far Albania has come into integrating itself in the Western world, when it was once considered one of the most anti-Western Stalinist reigns of all time. The expulsion of communism in Albania was generally much more peaceful in comparison to the revolutions that took place in the late 1980s in other oppressive communist countries throughout Eastern Europe that made up the Iron Curtain. For example, the uprising of the people against the government in Romania in December of 1989 was highly fatal and horrifically violent, resulting in the death of around 1,200 people and the execution of the country's leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife, Elena. Oppositely, a very minimal amount of fatalities took place in Albania during the effort against the regime, and Ramiz Alia negotiated very calmly with the students of Albania and gifted them with the right to political pluralism in just 4 days with little dissent. Finally, it is important to spread awareness about Albanian communism because it stands the risk of being forgotten, since most people are not educated on this event. According to Lolita Progini, a journalist who was persecuted by the communist regime, young people in the schools don't get any information about the atrocities of the communist regime. This event serves a precedent for the situation that is currently going on in North Korea, because although it might seem incredulous to think that the North Korean regime could ever peacefully offer basic human rights and freedoms to their people, Albania, under the rule of Hoxha, mirrors that of North Korea in present day. In a recent survey by Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it was revealed that half of Albanians thought that communism in Albania was a good idea, despite 80% of those surveyed being prosecuted by the regime. Additionally, 50% of Albanians think Hoxha had a positive impact or no impact at all, with contradictorily 44% cited lack of freedom as most negative feature. This goes to show that ultimately, Albania's former communist history is overlooked, and that the world should have a better understanding of what happened under the reign of Enver Hoxha due to the example that it sets for the present day.